Chapter 39, The Stormy Sixties, 1960 to 1968.
Complacent and comfortable as the 1950s closed, Americans elected in 1960 a young, vigorous president who pledged to get the country moving again. Neither the nation nor the new president had any inkling, as the new decade opened, just how action-packed it would be, both at home and abroad. The 1960s would bring a sexual revolution, a civil rights revolution, the emergence of youth culture, a devastating war in Vietnam, and the beginnings, at least, of a feminist revolution. By the end of the stormy 60s, many Americans would yearn nostalgically for the comparative calm of the 50s.
Funny, new response, and fail.
Exactly. Hatless and top coatless in the 22-degree chill, John F. Kennedy delivered a stirring inaugural address on January 20th, 1961. Tall, elegantly handsome, speaking crisply with a staccato finger jabs in the air, Kennedy personified the glamour and vitality of the new administration. The youngest president ever elected, he assembled one of the youngest cabinets, including his 35-year-old brother, Robert, as Attorney General. Bobby, the president quipped, would find some legal experience useful when he began to practice law. The new Attorney General set out, among other reforms, to recast the priorities of the FBI. The Bureau deployed nearly 1,000 agents on internal security work, but targeted only a dozen against organized crime and gave virtually no attention to civil rights violations. Robert Kennedy's efforts were stoutly resisted by J. Edgar Hoover, who had served as FBI director longer than the new Attorney General had been alive. Business whiz Robert S. McNamara left the presidency of the Ford Motor Company to take over the Defense Department. Along with other youthful, talented advisors, these appointees made up an inner circle of the best and the brightest men around the president. From the outset, Kennedy inspired high expectations, especially among the young. His challenge of a new frontier quickened patriotic pulses. He brought a warm heart to the Cold War when he proposed the Peace Corps, an army of idealistic and mostly youthful volunteers to bring American skills to underdeveloped countries. He summoned citizens to service with his clarion call to ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Himself Harvard-educated, Kennedy and his Ivy League lieutenants, heavily from Harvard, radiated confidence in their abilities. The president's personal grace and wit won him the deep affection of many of his fellow citizens. A journalist called Kennedy the most seductive man I've ever met. He exuded a sense of vibrant life and humor that seemed naturally to bubble up out of him. In an unprecedented gesture, he invited white-maned poet Robert Frost to speak at his inaugural ceremonies. The old Yankee versifier shrewdly took stock of the situation. "You're something of an Irish, and I suppose something of Harvard," he told Kennedy, and advised him to be more Irish than Harvard. The new frontier at home. Kennedy came into office with fragile Democratic majorities in Congress. Southern Democrats threatened to team up with the Republicans and axe new frontier proposals such as medical assistance for the aged and increased federal aid to education. Kennedy won a first round in his campaign for a more cooperative Congress when he forced an expansion of the all-important House Rules Committee, dominated by conservatives, who could have bottled up his entire legislative program. Despite this victory, the new frontier did not expand swiftly. Key medical and education bills remained stalled in Congress. Another vexing problem was the economy. Kennedy had campaigned on the theme of revitalizing the economy after the recessions of the Eisenhower years. While his advisors debated the best kind of economic medicine to apply, the president tried to hold the line against crippling inflation. His administration helped negotiate a non-inflationary wage agreement in the steel industry in early 1962. The assumption was that the companies, for their part, would also keep a lid on prices. Almost immediately, steel management announced significant price increases, thereby seemingly demonstrating bad faith. The president erupted in wrath, remarking that his father had once said that all businessmen were sons of bitches. He called the big steel men to the Oval Office carpet and unleashed his Irish temper. Overawed, the steel corp operators backed down while displaying SOB buttons, meaning sons of business or save our business. The steel episode provoked fiery attacks by big business on the new frontier. But Kennedy soon appealed to believers in free enterprise when he announced his support of a general tax cut bill. He rejected the advice of those who wished greater government spending and instead chose to stimulate the economy by slashing taxes and putting more money directly into private hands. When he announced his policy before a big business group, one observer called it the most Republican speech since McKinley. Remember, he's Democrat. For economic stimulus, as well as for military strategy and scientific prestige, Kennedy also promoted a multi-billion-dollar project to land an American on the moon. When skeptics objected that the money could best be spent elsewhere, Kennedy answered them in a speech at Rice University in Texas. But why, some say, the moon? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? $24 billion later, in 1969, 2 American astronauts triumphantly planted human footprints on the moon's dusty surface. Rumblings in Europe. A few months after settling into the White House, the new president met Soviet Premier Khrushchev at Vienna in June 1961. The tough-talking Soviet leader adopted a belligerent attitude, threatening to make a treaty with East Germany and cut off Western access to Berlin. Though visibly shaken, the president refused to be bullied. Soviets backed off from their most bellicose threats, but suddenly began to construct the Berlin Wall in August of 1961. A barbed wire and concrete barrier, it was designed to plug the heavy population drain from East Germany to West Germany through the Berlin Funnel. But to the free world, the Wall of Shame looked like a gigantic enclosure around a concentration camp. The wall stood for almost 3 decades as an ugly scar, symbolizing the post-World War II division of Europe into 2 hostile camps. Kennedy, meanwhile, turned his attention to Western Europe, now miraculously prospering after the tonic of Marshall Plan aid, and the growth of the American-encouraged common market, the free trade area later called the European Union. He finally secured the passage of the Trade Expansion Act in 1962, authorizing tariff cuts of up to 50% to promote trade with common market countries. This legislation led to the so-called Kennedy round of tariff negotiations concluded in 1967 and to a significant expansion of European and American trade. But not all of Kennedy's ambitious designs for Europe were realized. American policymakers were dedicated to an economically and militarily united Atlantic community, with the United States the dominant partner. But they found their way blocked by towering, stiff-backed Charles de Gaulle, president of France. He was suspicious of American intentions in Europe and on fire to recapture the gloire of Napoleonic France. With a haughty non, he vetoed British application for common market membership in 1963, fearing that the British special relationship with the United States would make Britain a Trojan horse for deepening American control over European allies and affairs. He likewise dashed Goldwater on a U.S. proposal to develop a multinational nuclear arm within NATO. De Gaulle deemed the Americans unreliable in a crisis, so he tried to preserve French freedom of action by developing his own small atomic force, or farce, scoffed his critics. Despite the perils of nuclear proliferation or Soviet domination, de Gaulle demanded an independent Europe, free of Yankee influence. Foreign flare-ups and flexible response. Special problems for U.S. foreign policy emerged from the worldwide decolonization of European overseas possessions after World War II. Please note, I'm going to pause for a minute, this is a huge backdrop to this whole Cold War, decolonization of European colonies. So the colonies of old Europe are now fighting for independence, and this is the big backdrop for the Cold War battle for influence. So worldwide decolonization of European overseas possession after World War II is big-time context. The African Congo received its independence from Belgium in 1960 and immediately exploded into violence. The United Nations sent in a peacekeeping force to which Washington contributed much money, but no manpower. The United States was picking up the tab for UN operations, while the organization itself was becoming dominated by numerous nascent nations emerging in once colonial Asia and Africa, which were often critical of U.S. foreign policy. Sparsely populated Laos, freed from its French colonial overlords in 1954, was festering dangerously by the time Kennedy came into office. The Eisenhower administration had drenched this jungle kingdom with dollars, but failed to cleanse the country of an aggressive communist element. A red Laos, many observers feared, would be a river on which the influence of communist China would flood into all of Southeast Asia. As the Laotian Civil War raged, Kennedy's military advisors seriously considered sending in American troops, but the president found that he had insufficient forces to put out the fire in Asia and still honor his commitments in Europe. Kennedy thus sought a diplomatic escape hatch in the 14-power Geneva Conference, which imposed a shaky peace on Laos in 1962. These brushfire wars intensified the pressure for a shift away from Secretary Dulles' dubious doctrine of massive retaliation. Kennedy felt hamstrung by the knowledge that in a crisis he had the devil's choice between humiliation and nuclear incineration. The Defense Secretary McNamara With the Defense Secretary McNamara, he pushed the strategy of flexible response, that is, developing an array of military options that could be precisely matched to the gravity of the crisis at hand. To this end, Kennedy increased spending on, 1, conventional military forces, and bolstered the Special Forces, also known as Green Berets. They were an elite anti-guerrilla outfit trained to survive on snake meat and to kill with scientific finesse. Flexible response, a shift away from massive retaliation of Eisenhower. Here comes the first test case, really, of flexible response. Stepping into the Vietnam quagmire. The doctrine of flexible response seemed sane enough, but it contained lethal logic. It potentially lowered the level at which diplomacy would give way to shooting. It also provided a mechanism for a progressive and possibly endless stepping up of use of force. Vietnam soon presented grisly proof of these pitfalls. The corrupt, right-wing Diem government in Saigon, South Vietnam, despite a huge deluge of American dollars, had ruled shakily since the partition of Vietnam in 1954. Anti-Diem agitators noisily threatened to topple the pro-American government from power. In a fateful decision late in 1961, Kennedy ordered a sharp increase in the number of military advisors, or U.S. troops, in South Vietnam. American forces had allegedly entered Vietnam to foster political stability, to help protect Diem from the communists long enough to allow him to enact basic social reforms favored by the Americans. But the Kennedy administration eventually despaired of the reactionary Diem and encouraged a successful coup against him in November of 1963. Ironically, the United States thus contributed to a long process of political disintegration that its original policy had meant to prevent. Kennedy still told the South Vietnamese that it was their war, but he had made dangerously deep political commitments. By the time of his death, he had ordered more than 15,000 American men into the far-off Asian slaughter pen. A graceful pullout was becoming increasingly difficult. So Americans were in South Vietnam to prop up the South Vietnam government, which was led by a corrupt leader who eventually we helped overthrow because we thought he was not doing a good enough job. Cuban confrontation, so from Vietnam to Cuba. Although the United States regarded Latin America as its backyard, its southern neighbors feared and resented the powerful colossus of the North. In 1961, Kennedy extended the hand of friendship with the Alliance of Progress, hailed as the Marshall Plan for Latin America. A primary goal was to help the good neighbors close the gap between the callous rich and the wretched poor, and thus quiet communist agitation. But results were disappointing. There was little alliance and even less progress. American handouts had little positive impact on Latin Americans' immense social problems. President Kennedy also struck below the border with a mailed fist. He had inherited from Eisenhower a CIA-backed scheme to topple Fidel Castro from power by invading Cuba with anti-communist exiles. Trained and armed by Americans and supported by American air power, the invaders would trigger a popular uprising in Cuba and sweep to victory, or so the planners predicted. On April 17, 1961, some 1,200 exiles landed at Cuba's Bay of Pigs. Kennedy had decided from the outset against direct intervention, and the ancient aircraft of the anti-Castrites were no match for Castro's Air Force. In addition, no popular uprising greeted the invaders. With the invasion bogged down at the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy stood fast in his decision to keep hands off, and the bullet-riddled band of anti-Castrites surrendered. Most of the invaders rotted for 2 years in Cuban jails, but were eventually ransomed for some $62 million worth of American pharmaceutical drugs and other humanitarian supplies. President Kennedy assumed full responsibility for the failure, remarking that victory has 100 fathers, and defeat is an orphan. The Bay of Pigs blunder, along with continuing American covert, secret efforts to assassinate Castro and overthrow his government, naturally pushed the Cuban leader even farther into the Soviet embrace. Wily Chairman Khrushchev lost little time in taking full advantage of his Cuban comrade's position just 90 miles off Florida's coast. In October of 1962, the aerial photographs of American spy planes revealed that the Soviets were secretly and speedily installing nuclear-tipped missiles in Cuba. The Soviets evidently intended to use these devastating weapons to shield Castro and to blackmail the United States into backing down in Berlin and other trouble spots. Kennedy and Khrushchev now began a nerve-wracking game of nuclear chicken. The president flatly rejected Air Force proposals for a surgical bombing strike against the missile launch sites. Instead, on October 22, 1962, he ordered a naval quarantine of Cuba and demanded immediate removal of the threatening weaponry. He also served notice on Khrushchev that any attack on the United States from Cuba would be regarded as coming from the Soviet Union and would trigger nuclear retaliation against the Russian heartland. For an ancient week, Americans waited while the Soviet ships approached the patrol line established by the U.S. Navy off the island of Cuba. Seizing or sinking a Soviet vessel on the high seas would unquestionably be regarded by the Kremlin as an act of war. The world teetered breathlessly on the brink of global atomization. Only in 1991 did the full dimensions of this nuclear peril become known, when the Russians revealed that their ground forces in Cuba already had operational nuclear weapons at their disposal and were authorized to launch them if attacked. In this tense eyeball-to-eyeball confrontation, Khrushchev finally flinched. On October 28th, he agreed to a partially face-saving compromise, by which he would pull missiles out of Cuba. The United States, in return, agreed to end the quarantine and not invade the island. The American government also quietly signaled that it would remove from Turkey some of its own missiles targeted on the Soviet Union. Fallout from the Cuban Missile Crisis was considerable. A disgraced Khrushchev was ultimately hounded out of the Kremlin and became an unperson. Hardliners in Moscow, vowing never again to be humiliated in a nuclear face-off, launched an enormous program of military expansion. The Soviet buildup reached a crescendo in the next decade, stimulating, in turn, a vast American effort to catch up with the Russians. The Democrats did better than expected in the midterm elections of November 1962, allegedly because the Republicans were Cubanized. Kennedy, apparently sobered by the appalling risks he had just run, pushed harder for a nuclear test ban treaty with the Soviet Union. After prolonged negotiations in Moscow, a pact prohibiting nuclear trial explosions in the atmosphere was signed in late 1963. Another barometer indicating the thaw in the Cold War was the installation, in 1963, of a Moscow to Washington hotline permitting immediate teletype communications in the case of crisis. Most significant was Kennedy's speech at American University in Washington, D.C. In June 1963, the president urged Americans to abandon a view of the Soviet Union as a devil-ridden land filled with fanatics, and instead to deal with the world as it is, not as it might have been had the history of the last 18 years been different. Kennedy thus tried to lay the foundations for a realistic policy of peaceful coexistence with the Soviet Union. Here were the modest origins of the policy that later became known as détente, or French for relaxation. The struggle for civil rights. Kennedy had campaigned with a strong appeal to black voters, but he proceeded gingerly to redeem his promises. Although he had pledged to eliminate racial discrimination in housing with a stroke of the pen, it took him nearly 2 years to find the right pen. Civil rights groups, meanwhile, sent thousands of pens to the White House in an ink for Jack protest against the president's slowness. Political concerns stayed the president's hand on civil rights. Elected by wafer-thin margin and with shaky control over Congress, Kennedy needed the support of Southern legislators to pass his economic and social legislation, especially his medical and educational bills. He believed, perhaps justifiably, that those measures would eventually benefit black Americans at least as much as specific legislation on civil rights. Bold moves for racial justice would have to wait. But events soon scrambled these carefully calculated plans. Following the wave of sit-ins that surged across the South in 1960, groups of freedom riders fanned out to end segregation in facilities serving interstate bus passengers. A white mob torched a Freedom Ride bus near Anniston, Alabama in May 1961, and Attorney General Robert Kennedy's personal representative was beaten unconscious in another anti-Freedom Ride riot in Montgomery. When Southern officials proved unwilling or unable to stem the violence, Washington dispatched federal marshals to protect the Freedom Riders. Reluctantly, but faithfully, the Kennedy administration had now joined hands with the Civil Rights Movement. Because of that partnership, the Kennedys proved ultra-wary about the political associations of Martin Luther King Jr. Fearful of embarrassing revelations that some of King's advisors had communist affiliations, Robert Kennedy ordered FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover to wiretap King's phone in late 1963. But for the most part, the relationship between King and the Kennedys was a fruitful one. Encouraged by Robert Kennedy and with financial backing from Kennedy-private foundations, SNCC and other civil rights groups inaugurated a voter education project to register the South's historically disenfranchised blacks. Because of his support for civil rights, President Kennedy told the group of black leaders in 1963, "I may lose the next election, but I don't care." Integrating Southern universities threatened to provoke wholesale slaughter. Some desegregated painlessly, but the University of Mississippi became a volcano. A 29-year-old Air Force veteran, James Meredith, Meredith encountered violent opposition when he attempted to register in October 1962. In the end, President Kennedy was forced to send 400 federal marshals and 3,000 troops to enroll Meredith in his first class. In colonial American history, he ultimately graduated with a sheepskin that cost him the lives of 2 men, scores of injuries, and some $4 million taxpayer dollars. In the spring of 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. launched a campaign against discrimination in Birmingham, Alabama, the most segregated big city in America. Although blacks constituted nearly half the city's population, they made up fewer than 15% of the city's voters. Previous attempts to crack the city's rigid racial barriers had produced more than 50 cross burnings and 18 bomb attacks since 1957. Some of the people sitting here will not come back alive from this campaign, King advised his organizers. Events soon confirmed this grim prediction of violence. Watching developments on television screens, a horrified world saw peaceful civil rights marchers repeatedly repelled by police with attack dogs and electric cattle prods. Most fearsome of all were the high-pressure water hoses directed at civil rights demonstrators. They delivered water with enough force to knock bricks loose from buildings or strip bark from trees at a distance of 100 feet. Water from the hoses bowled little children down the street like tumbleweed. Jolted by these vicious confrontations, President Kennedy delivered a memorable televised speech to the nation on June 11, 1963. In contrast to Eisenhower's cool aloofness from the racial question, Kennedy called the situation a moral issue and committed his personal and presidential prestige to finding a solution. Drawing on the same spiritual traditions as Martin Luther King Jr., Kennedy declared that the principle at stake is as old as the Scriptures and is as clear as the American Constitution. He called for a new civil rights legislation to protect black citizens. In August, King led 200,000 black and white demonstrators on a peaceful march on Washington in support of the proposed legislation. In an electrifying speech from the Lincoln Memorial, King declared, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." Still, violence continued. On the very night of Kennedy's stirring television address, a white gunman shot down Medgar Evers, a black Mississippi civil rights worker. In September 1963, an explosion blasted a Baptist church in Birmingham, killing 4 black girls who had just finished their lessons, called The Love That Forgives. By the time of Kennedy's death, his civil rights bill was making little headway, and frustrated blacks were growing increasingly impatient. The killing of Kennedy. Violence haunted America in the mid-1960s, and it stalked onto the center stage on November 22, 1963. While riding in an open limousine in downtown Dallas, Texas, President Kennedy was shot in the brain by a concealed rifleman and died within seconds. As a stunned nation grieved, the tragedy grew still more unbelievable. The alleged assassin, a furtive figure named Lee Harvey Oswald, was himself shot to death in front of a television camera by a self-appointed avenger, Jack Ruby. So bizarre were the events surrounding the 2 murders that even an elaborate official investigation conducted by Chief Justice Warren could not quiet all the doubts and theories about what had really happened. Vice President Johnson was promptly sworn in as president on a waiting airplane and flown back to Washington with Kennedy's body. Although he mistrusted the Harvards, Johnson retained most of the bright Kennedy team. The new president managed a dignified and efficient transition, pledging continuity with his slain predecessor's policies. For several days, the nation was steeped in sorrow, but not until then did many Americans realize how fully their young, vibrant president and his captivating wife had cast a spell over them. Chopped down in his prime, after only slightly more than 1,000 days in the White House, Kennedy was acclaimed more for the ideals he had enunciated and the spirit he had kindled than for the concrete goals he had achieved. He had laid one myth to rest forever, that a Catholic could not be trusted with the presidency of the United States. In later years, revelations about Kennedy's womanizing and allegations about his involvement with organized crime figures tarnished his reputation. But despite those accusations, his vigor, charisma, and idealism made him an inspirational figure for the generation of Americans who came of age in the 1960s, including Bill Clinton, who, as a boy, had briefly met President Kennedy and would himself be elected president in 1992. The LBJ brand of the presidency. The torch passed to craggy-faced Lyndon Baines Johnson, a Texan who towered 6 feet 3 inches. The new president hailed from the populous hill country of West Texas, whose people had first sent him to Washington as a 29-year-old congressman in 1937. Franklin D. Roosevelt was his political daddy, Johnson claimed, and he had supported New Deal measures down the line. But when LBJ lost the Senate race in 1941, he learned the sobering lesson that liberal political beliefs did not necessarily win elections in Texas. He trimmed his sails to the right and squeezed himself into a Senate seat in 1948, with a questionable 87-vote margin, hence the ironic nickname Landslide Lyndon. Entrenched in the Senate, Johnson developed into a masterful wheeler and dealer. He became the Democratic Majority Leader in 1954, wielding power second only to that of Eisenhower in the White House. He could move mountains or checkmate opponents as the occasion demanded, using what came to be known as the Johnson treatment, a flashing display of backslapping, flesh-pressing, and arm-twisting that overbore friend and foe alike. His ego and vanity were legendary. On a visit to the Pope, Johnson was presented with a precious 14th century painting from the Vatican art collection. In return, LBJ gave the Pope a bust of LBJ. As president, Johnson quickly shed the conservative coloration of his Senate years to reveal the latent liberal underneath. No memorial oration or eulogy, Johnson declared to Congress, could more eloquently honor President Kennedy's memory than the earliest possible passage of the Civil Rights Bill for which he fought so long. After a lengthy conservative filibuster, Congress at last passed the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964. No, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The act banned racial discrimination in most private facilities open to the public, including theaters, hospitals, and restaurants. It strengthened the federal government's power to end segregation in schools and other public spaces. It created the Federal Equal Opportunity Commission to eliminate discrimination in hiring. When conservatives tried to derail the legislation by adding a prohibition on sexual as well as racial discrimination, the tactic backfired. The bill's opponents cynically calculated that liberals would not be able to support a bill that threatened to wipe out laws that singled out women for special protection because of their sex. But the Act's Title VII passed with the sexual clause intact. It soon proved to be a powerful instrument of federally enforced gender equality as well as racial equality. Johnson struck another blow for women and minorities in 1965 when he issued an executive order requiring all federal contractors to take affirmative action against discrimination. Johnson also rammed Kennedy's stalled tax bill through Congress and added proposals of his own for a billion-dollar war on poverty. Johnson voiced special concern for Appalachia, where the sickness of the soft coal industry had left tens of thousands of mountain folk on the human slag heap. Johnson dubbed his domestic program the Great Society, a sweeping set of New Dealish economic and welfare measures aimed at transforming the American way of life. Public support for LBJ's anti-poverty war was aroused by Michael Harrington's The Other America, which revealed that in affluent America, 20% of the population and over 40% of the black population suffered in poverty. So no Johnson's Great Society anti-poverty plan, and also the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Johnson battles Goldwater in 1964. Johnson's nomination by the Democrats in 1964 was a foregone conclusion. He was chosen by acclamation in Atlantic City as his birthday present. Thanks to the tall Texan, the Democrats stood foursquare on the most liberal platform since Truman's Fair Deal days. The Republicans, convening in San Francisco's Cow Palace, nominated box-jawed Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona, a bronzed and bespectacled champion of the rock-ribbed conservatism. The American stage was thus set for an historic clash of political principles. Goldwater's forces had galloped out of the Southwest to ride roughshod over the more moderate Republican Eastern establishment. Insisting that the GOP offer a choice, not an echo, Goldwater attacked the federal income tax, the Social Security system, the Tennessee Valley Authority, civil rights legislation, the nuclear test ban treaty, and most loudly the Great Society. His fiercely dedicated followers proclaimed, "In your heart you know he's right," which prompted the Democratic response, "In your guts you know he's nuts." Goldwater warmed right-wing hearts when he announced that extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice, and moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue. Democrats gleefully exploited the image of Goldwater as a trigger-happy cowboy who would bury us in the debris of World War III. Johnson cultivated the contrasting image of a resolute statesman by seizing upon the Tonkin Gulf episode early in August 1964. Unbeknownst to the American public or Congress, U.S. Navy ships had been cooperating with South Vietnamese gunboats in provocative raids along the coast of North Vietnam. Two of these American destroyers were allegedly fired upon by North Vietnamese on August 2nd and 4th, although exactly what happened still remains unclear. Later investigations strongly suggested that the North Vietnamese fired in self-defense on August 2nd and that the attack, quote-unquote, of August 4th never happened. Johnson later reportedly wisecracked, "For all I know, the Navy was shooting at whales out there." Johnson nevertheless promptly called the attack unprovoked and moved swiftly to make political hay out of this episode. He ordered a limited retaliatory air raid against North Vietnamese bases, loudly proclaiming that he sought no wider war, thus implying that the truculent Goldwater did. Johnson also used the incident to spur congressional passage of the all-purpose Tonkin Gulf Resolution. With only 2 dissenting votes in both houses, the lawmakers virtually abdicated their war-declaring powers and handed the president a blank check to use further force in Southeast Asia. The Tonkin Gulf Resolution, Johnson boasted, was like Grandma's nightshirt. It covered everything. The towering Texan rode to a spectacular victory in November 1964. The voters were herded into Johnson's column by fondness for the Kennedy legacy, faith in Great Society promises, and fear of Goldwater. A stampede of over 43 million Johnson votes trampled the Republican ticket with its 27 million supporters. The tally in the Electoral College was 486 to 52. Goldwater carried only his native Arizona and 5 other states, all of them significantly in the racially restless South. This cracking of the once solidly Democratic South afforded the Republicans about the only faint light in the otherwise bleak political picture. Johnson's record-breaking 61% of the popular vote swept lopsided Democratic majorities into both houses of Congress. I want to pause here for a minute to note, 1964 with Goldwater, it's a very significant election. It flips the South to the Republican camp, which it still is to this day, and Goldwater conservatism essentially sets the foundation for modern-day conservatism that comes with Nixon and eventually in the 1980s with Reagan. And I think we still see it today. Back to the book. The Great Society Congress. Johnson's huge victory temporarily smashed the conservative congressional coalition of Southern Democrats and Northern Republicans. A wide-open legislative road stretched before the Great Society programs as the president skillfully ringmastered his 2-to-1 Democratic majorities. Congress poured out a flood of legislation comparable only to the output of the New Dealers in the 100 Days Congress of 1933. Johnson, confident that a growing economy gave him ample fiscal and political room for maneuver, delivered at last a long-deferred Democratic promises of social reform. Escalating the war on poverty, Congress doubled the appropriation of the Office of Economic Opportunity to $2 billion and granted more than $1 billion to redevelop the gutted hills and hollows of Appalachia. A tireless Johnson also prodded the Congress into creating 2 new cabinet offices, the Department of Transportation and the Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, to which he named the first black cabinet secretary in the nation's history, respected economist Robert C. Weaver. Other noteworthy laws established the National Endowments for the Arts and Humanities, designed to lift the level of American cultural life. And even more impressive were the Big Four legislative achievements that crowned LBJ's Great Society program: aid to education, Medicare for the elderly and indigent poor, immigration reform, and a new voting rights bill. Johnson neatly avoided the thorny questions of separation of church and state by channeling educational aid to students, not to schools, thus allowing funds to flow to hard-pressed parochial institutions as well. Catholic John F. Kennedy had not dared to touch this prickly issue. With a keen eye for the dramatic, LBJ signed the education bill in the humble one-room Texas schoolhouse he attended as a boy. And this next one is huge. Medicare for the elderly, accompanied by Medicaid for the poor, became a reality in 1965. Although they were bitter pills for the American Medical Association to swallow, the new programs were welcomed by millions of older Americans who had no health insurance, half of those over the age of 65 in 1965, and by the poor who could not afford proper medical treatment. Like the New Deal Social Security program, Medicare and Medicaid created entitlements. That is, they conferred rights on certain categories of Americans virtually in perpetuity, without the need for repeated congressional approval. These programs were part of a spreading rights revolution that materially improved the lives of millions of Americans, but also eventually undermined the federal government's financial health. Immigration reform was the third of Johnson's Big Four feats. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 abolished at last the national origins quota system that had been in place since 1921. The act also doubled to 290,000 the number of immigrants allowed to enter annually, while for the first time setting limits on immigration from the Western Hemisphere. The new law further provided for the admission of close relatives of the United States citizens, outside those numerical limits. To the surprise of many of the Act's architects, more than 100,000 persons per year took advantage of its family unification provisions in the decades after 1965, and the immigrant stream swelled beyond expectations. Even more surprising to the Act's sponsors, the sources of immigration soon shifted heavily from Europe to Latin America and Asia, dramatically changing the racial and ethnic composition of the American population. Great Society programs came in for rancorous political attack in later years. Conservatives charged that poverty could not be papered over with greenbacks, and that the billions spent for social engineering had simply been flushed down the wastepipe. Yet the poverty rate declined measurably in the ensuing decade. Medicare made especially dramatic reductions in the incidence of poverty among Americans elderly. Other anti-poverty programs, among them Project Head Start, sharply improved the educational performance of underprivileged youth. Infant mortality rates also fell in minority communities as general health conditions improved. Lyndon Johnson was not fully victorious in the war against poverty, and he doubtless fought some costly and futile campaigns, but he did win several noteworthy battles. Battling for black rights. With the last of his big four reforms, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Johnson made heartening headway against one of the most persistent American evils, racial discrimination. In Johnson's native South, the walls of segregation were crumbling, but not fast enough for long-suffering African Americans. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 gave the federal government more muscle to enforce school desegregation orders and to prohibit racial discrimination in all kinds of public accommodations and employment. But the problem of voting rights remained. In Mississippi, which had the largest black minority in any state, only about 5% of eligible blacks were registered to vote. The lopsided pattern was similar throughout the South. Ballot-denying devices like the poll tax, literacy tests, and barefaced intimidation still barred black people from the political process. Mississippi law required the names of prospective black registrants to be published for 2 weeks in local newspapers, a device that virtually guaranteed economic reprisals or worse. Beginning in 1964, opening up the polling booths became the chief goal of the black movement in the South. The 24th Amendment, ratified in January 1964, abolished the poll tax in federal elections. Blacks joined hands with white civil rights workers, many of them student volunteers from the North, in a massive voter registration drive in Mississippi during the Freedom Summer of 1964. Singing "We Shall Overcome," they zealously set out to soothe generations of white anxieties and black fears. But events soon brightened hopes. In late June 1964, one black and two white civil rights workers disappeared in Mississippi. Their badly beaten bodies were later found buried beneath an earthen dam. FBI investigators eventually arrested 21 white Mississippians, including the local sheriff, in connection with the killings, but white juries refused to convict whites for these murders. In August, an integrated Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party delegation was denied its seat at the National Democratic Convention. Only a handful of black Mississippians had succeeded in registering to vote. Early in 1965, Martin Luther King Jr. resumed the voter registration campaign in Selma, Alabama, where blacks made up 50% of the population, but only 1% of the voters. State troopers with tear gas and whips assaulted King's demonstrators as they marched peacefully to the state capitol at Montgomery. A Boston Unitarian minister was killed, and a few days later a white Detroit woman was shotgunned to death by Klansmen on the highway near Selma. As the nation recoiled in horror before these violent scenes, President Johnson, speaking in soft Southern accents, delivered a compelling address on television. What happened in Selma, he insisted, concerned all Americans, who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. Then, in a stirring adaptation of the anthem of the Civil Rights Movement, the president concluded, "And we shall overcome." Following words with deeds, Johnson speedily shepherded through the Congress the landmark Voting Rights Act of 1965, signed into law on August 6. It outlawed literacy tests and sent federal voting registrars into several southern states. The passage of the Voting Rights Act, exactly 100 years after the conclusion of the Civil War, climaxed a century of awful abuse and robust resurgence for African Americans in the South. "Give us the ballot," said Martin Luther King Jr., "and the South will never be the same again." He was right.
The act did not end discrimination and oppression overnight, but it placed an awesome lever for change in blacks' hands. Black Southerners now had power and began to wield it without fear of reprisals. White Southerners began to court black votes and business as never before. In the following decade, for the first time since emancipation, African Americans began to migrate into the South. Black Power. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 marked the end of an era in the history of the civil rights movement. The era of nonviolent demonstrations focused on the South, led by peaceful moderates like Martin Luther King Jr., and aimed at integrating blacks into American society. As if to symbolize that turn of events, just 5 days after President Johnson signed the landmark voting law, a bloody riot erupted in Watts, a black ghetto in Los Angeles. Blacks, enraged by police brutality, burned and looted their own neighborhoods for nearly a week. When the smoke finally cleared over the Los Angeles basin, 31 blacks and 3 whites lay dead. More than 1,000 people had been injured, and hundreds of buildings stood charred and gutted. The Watts explosion heralded a new phase for the black struggle, increasingly marked by militant confrontation focused on northern and western cities, led by radical and sometimes violent spokespersons, and often aiming not at interracial cooperation, but at black separatism. The pious Christian moderation of Martin Luther King Jr. came under heavy fire from the second wave of younger black leaders, who privately mocked the dignified Dr. King as "de Lord." Deepening division among black leaders was highlighted by the career of Malcolm X. Born Malcolm Little, he was at first inspired by the militant black nationalists in the Nation of Islam. Like the nation's founder, Elijah Muhammad, born Elijah Poole, Malcolm changed his surname to advertise the lost African identity in white America. A brilliant and charismatic preacher, Malcolm X trumpeted black separatism and inveighed against the blue-eyed white devils. Eventually, Malcolm distanced himself from Elijah Muhammad's separatist preachings and moved towards mainstream Islam. By the 1990s, Islam was among America's fastest-growing religions and counted some 2 million African Americans, or reverts, as Muslim described it, in its ranks. Malcolm changed his name yet again to Al-Haj Malik al-Shabazz and began to preach a more conciliatory message. But in early 1965, he was cut down by rival Nation of Islam gunmen while speaking at a large crowd in New York City. With frightening frequency, violence, or the threat of violence, raised its head in the black community. The Black Panther Party openly brandished weapons in the streets of Oakland, California. The following year, Trinidad-born Stokely Carmichael, a leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, urged the abandonment of peaceful demonstrations and instead promoted Black Power. The very phrase Black Power unsettled many whites, and their fears increased when Carmichael was quoted as gloating that Black Power will smash everything Western civilization has created. Some advocates of Black Power insisted that they simply intended the slogan to describe a broad front effort to exercise the political and economic rights gained by the civil rights movement and to speed the integration of American society. But other African Americans, recollecting previous black nationalist movements like that of Marcus Garvey earlier in the century, breathed a vibrant separatist meaning into the concept of Black Power. They emphasized African Americans' distinctiveness, promoted Afro hairstyles and dress, shed their white names for new African identities, and demanded black studies programs in schools and universities. Ironically, just as the civil rights movement had achieved its greatest legal and political triumphs, more city-shaking riots erupted in black ghettos of several American cities. A bloody outburst in Newark, New Jersey, in the summer of 1967 took 25 lives. Federal troops restored order in Detroit, Michigan, after 43 people died in the streets. As in Los Angeles, black rioters torched their own neighborhoods, attacking police officers and even firefighters who had to battle both flames and mobs howling, "Burn, baby, burn." These righteous outbursts angered many white Americans who threatened to retaliate with their own backlash against ghetto arsonists and killers. Inner-city anarchy baffled many Northerners who had considered racial problems purely Southern questions. But black concerns had moved north, as had nearly half the nation's black people. In the North, the Black Power movement now focused less on civil rights and more on economic demands. Black unemployment, for example, was nearly double that for whites. These oppressive new problems seemed even less likely to be solved peaceably than the struggle for voting rights in the South. Despair deepened when the magnetic and moderate voice of Martin Luther King Jr. was forever silenced by a sniper's bullet in Memphis on April 4, 1968. A martyr for justice, he had bled and died against the peculiarly American-born thorn of race. The killing of King cruelly robbed the American people of one of the most inspirational leaders in their history at a time when they could least afford to lose him. This outrage triggered a nationwide orgy of ghetto gutting and violence that cost over 40 lives. Rioters noisily made news, but thousands of other blacks quietly made history. Their voter registration in the South shot upward, and by the late 1960s, several hundred blacks had held elected office in the Old South. Cleveland, Ohio, and Gary, Indiana elected black mayors. By 1972, nearly half of Southern black children sat in integrated classrooms. Actually, more schools in the South were integrated than in the North. About a third of black families had risen economically into the ranks of middle class, though an equal proportion remained below the poverty line. King left a shining legacy of racial progress, but he was cut down when the job was far from completed. Combating communism in two hemispheres. Violence at home eclipsed Johnson's legislative triumphs, while foreign flare-ups threatened his political life. Discontented Dominicans rose in revolt against their military government in April of 1965. Johnson speedily announced that the Dominican Republic was the target of a Castro-like coup by communist conspirators, and he dispatched American troops, ultimately some 25,000, to restore order. But the evidence of a communist takeover was fragmentary at best. Johnson was widely condemned at home and in Latin America for his temporary reversion to the officially abandoned gunboat diplomacy. Critics charged that the two-fisted Texan was far too eager to back right-wing regimes with rifle-toting troops. At about the same time, Johnson was floundering deeper into the monsoon mud of Vietnam. Viet Cong guerrillas attacked an American airbase at Pleiku in South Vietnam in February 1965. The president immediately ordered retaliatory bombing raids against military installations in North Vietnam, and for the first time ordered attacking U.S. troops to land. By the middle of March 1965, the Americans had Operation Rolling Thunder in full swing, regular full-scale bombing attacks against North Vietnam. Before 1965 ended, some 184 American troops were involved, most of them slogging through the jungles and rice paddies of South Vietnam, searching for guerrillas clad in black pajamas. Johnson had now taken the first fateful steps down a slippery path. He and his advisors believed that a fine-tuned, step-by-step escalation of American force would drive the enemy to defeat the minimum loss of life on both sides. But the president reckoned without due knowledge of the toughness, resiliency, and dedication of the Viet Cong guerrillas in South Vietnam and their North Vietnam allies. Aerial bombardment actually strengthened the communists' will to resist. The enemy matched every increase in American firepower with more men and more willingness in the art of guerrilla warfare. That's more wiliness in the art of guerrilla warfare. The South Vietnamese themselves were meanwhile becoming spectators in their own war, as the fighting became increasingly Americanized. Corrupt and collapsible governments succeeded each other in Saigon with bewildering rapidity. Yet American officials continued to talk of defending a faithful democratic ally. Washington spokesmen also defended America's action as a test of Uncle Sam's commitment and of the reliability of his numerous treaty pledges to resist communist encroachment. If the United States were to cut and run from Vietnam, claimed pro-war hawks, other nations would doubt Americans' word and crumble under communist pressure, the so-called domino theory, which would ostensibly drive America's first line of defense back to Waikiki Beach in Hawaii or even the coast of California. Persuaded by such panicky thinking, Johnson steadily raised the military stakes in Vietnam. By 1968, he had poured more than 500,000 troops into Southeast Asia, and the annual bill for the war was exceeding $30 billion. Yet the end was nowhere in sight. Vietnam vexations. America could not defeat the enemy in Vietnam, but it seemed to be defeating itself. World opinion grew increasingly hostile. The blasting of an underdeveloped country by a mighty superpower struck many critics as obscene. Several nations expelled American Peace Corps volunteers. Haughty Charles de Gaulle, ever suspicious of American intentions, ordered NATO off French soil in 1966. Overcommitment in Southeast Asia also tied Americans' hands elsewhere. Capitalizing on American distractions in Vietnam, the Soviet Union expanded its influence in the Mediterranean area, especially in Egypt. Tiny Israel stunned the Soviet-backed Egyptians in a devastating Six-Day War in June 1967. When the smoke had cleared, Israel occupied new territories in the Sinai Peninsula, the Golan Heights, and the Gaza Strip, and the West Bank of the Jordan River, including Jerusalem. Although the Israelis eventually withdrew from the Sinai, they refused to relinquish their other areas and even introduced Jewish settlers into the heavily Arab district of the West Bank. The Arab Palestinians already living in the West Bank and their Arab allies elsewhere complained loudly about these Israeli policies, but to no avail. The Middle East was becoming ever more dangerously packed powder keg, with the war-plagued United States was powerless to diffuse. Domestic discontent festered as the Vietnam entanglement dragged on. Anti-war demonstrations had begun on a small scale with campus teach-ins in 1965, and gradually these protests mounted to a tidal wave proportion as the long arm of the military draft dragged more and more young men off to Southeast Asia as a slaughter pen. Resistance stiffened. Thousands of draft registrants fled to Canada. Others publicly burned their draft cards. Hundreds of thousands of marchers filled the streets of New York, San Francisco, and other cities chanting, "Hell no, we won't go," and "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" Countless citizens felt the pinch of war-spawned inflation. Many Americans also felt pangs of conscience at the spectacle of their countrymen burning peasant huts and blistering civilians with gasoline napalm. Opposition in Congress to the Vietnam involvement centered in the influential Senate Committee of Foreign Relations, headed by a former Rhodes Scholar, Senator William Fulbright of Arkansas. A constant thorn in the side of the president, he staged a series of widely viewed televised hearings in 1966 and 1967, during which prominent personages aired their views, largely anti-war. Gradually, the public came to feel that it had been deceived about the causes and winnability of the war. A yawning credibility gap opened between the government and the people. New flocks of anti-war doves were hatching daily. And I know that term credibility gap. It's what the people's faith in the government is, the gap between the credibility between the government and the people. People didn't believe the government. Even within the administration, doubts were deepening about the wisdom of the war in Vietnam. When Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara expressed increasing discomfiture at the course of events, he was quietly eased out of the cabinet. Years later, McNamara wrote that we were wrong, terribly wrong about Vietnam. President Johnson did announce bombing halts in early 1966 and early 1967, supposedly to lure the enemy to the peace table, but Washington did not pursue its peace offensive with much energy, and the other side did not respond with any encouragement. Both sides used the bombing pauses to funnel more troops into South Vietnam. By early 1968, the brutal and futile struggle had become the longest and most unpopular foreign war in the nation's history. The government had failed utterly to explain to the people what was supposed to be at stake in Vietnam. Many critics wondered if any objective could be worth that vast price in blood and treasure that America was paying. Casualties, killed and wounded, already exceeded 100,000. More bombs had been dropped on Vietnam than any and all enemy territory in World War II. The war had also ripping apart the fabric of American society and even threatening to shred the Constitution. In 1967, President Johnson ordered the CIA, in clear violation of its charter as a foreign intelligence agency, to spy on domestic anti-war activists. He also encouraged the FBI to turn its counterintelligence program, codenamed COINTELPRO, against the peace movement. COINTELPRO had been launched by J. Edgar Hoover in the 1950s to infiltrate communist organizations. Now, under President's directive, it sabotaged peace groups by conducting black bag break-ins. COINTELPRO also subverted leading doves with false accusations that they were communist sympathizers. These clandestine tactics made the FBI look like a totalitarian state's secret police rather than a guardian of American democracy. As the war dragged on, evidence mounted that America had been entrapped in an agent civil war, fighting against highly motivated rebels who were striving to overthrow an oppressive regime. Yet Johnson clung to his basic strategy of ratcheting up the pressure bit by bit. He stubbornly assured doubting Americans that he could see the light at the end of the tunnel. But to growing numbers of Americans, it seemed that Johnson was bent on saving Vietnam by destroying it. Vietnam topples Johnson. Hawkish illusions that the struggle was about to be won were shattered by a blistering communist offensive launched in late 1968 during Tet, the Vietnam New Year. At a time when the Viet Cong were supposedly licking their wounds, they suddenly and simultaneously mounted savage attacks on 27 key South Vietnamese cities, including the capital, Saigon. Although eventually beaten off with heavy losses, they demonstrated anew that victory could not be gained by Johnson's strategy of gradual escalation. The Tet Offensive ended in a military defeat, but a political victory for the Viet Cong. With an increasingly insistent voice, American public opinion demanded a speedy end to the war. Opposition grew so vehement that President Johnson could feel the very foundations of government shaking under his feet. He was also suffering through hells of personal agony over American casualties. He wept as he signed letters of condolence, and slipped off at night to pray with monks at a small Catholic church in Washington. American military leaders responded to the Tet attacks with a request for 200,000 more troops, the largest single increment yet. This addition would have swollen American troop strength in Vietnam to about 750,000 mark. The size of the request staggered many policymakers. Former Secretary of State Dean Acheson reportedly advised the president that the Joint Chiefs of Staff don't know what they're talking about. Johnson himself now began to doubt seriously the wisdom of continuing on his raise-the-stakes course. No, the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, turning point in American public opinion. The president, meanwhile, was being sharply challenged from within his own party. Eugene McCarthy, a little-known Democratic senator from Minnesota, had emerged as a contender for the 1968 Democratic presidential nomination. The soft-spoken McCarthy, a sometimes poet and devout Catholic, gathered a small army of anti-war college students as campaign workers. Going clean for Gene, with shaven faces and shortened locks, these idealistic recruits of the Children's Crusade invaded the key presidential primary state of New Hampshire to ring doorbells. On March 12, 1968, their efforts gave McCarthy an incredible 42% of the Democratic votes and 20 of the 24 convention delegates. President Johnson was on the same ballot, but only as a write-in candidate. 4 days later, Senator Robert F. Kennedy of New York, the murdered president's younger brother, and by now himself a dove on Vietnam, threw his hat into the ring. The charismatic Kennedy, heir to his fallen brother's mantle of leadership, stirred a passionate response among workers, African Americans, Hispanics, and young people. These startling events abroad and at home were not lost on LBJ. The country might explode in greater violence if he met the request of the generals for more troops. His own party was dangerously divided on the war issue. He might not even be able to win renomination after his relatively poor showings in New Hampshire. Yet he remained committed to victory in Vietnam, even if the light at the end of the tunnel was vanishing. How could he salvage his blind alley policy? Johnson's answer came in a bombshell address on March 31, 1968. He announced on a nationwide television that he would finally apply the brakes to the escalating war. He would freeze American troop levels and gradually shift more responsibility to the South Vietnamese themselves. Aerial bombardment of the enemy would be drastically scaled down. Then, in a dramatic plea to unify a dangerously divided nation, Johnson startled his vast audience by firmly declaring that he would not be a candidate for the presidency in 1968. Johnson's abdication had the effect of preserving the military status quo. He had held the hawks in check while offering himself as a sacrifice to the militant doves. The United States could thus maintain the maximum acceptable level of military activity in Vietnam with one hand, while trying to negotiate a settlement with the other. North Vietnam responded somewhat encouragingly 3 days later when it expressed a willingness to talk about peace. After a month-long of haggling over the site, adversaries agreed to meet in Paris, but progress was glacially slow as prolonged bickering developed over the very shape of the conference table. The presidential sweepstakes of 1968. The summer of 1968 was one of the hottest political seasons in the nation's history. Johnson's heir apparent for the Democratic nomination was his liberal vice president, Hubert Humphrey, a former pharmacist, college professor, mayor, and U.S. senator from Minnesota. Loyally supporting LBJ's Vietnam policies through thick and thin, he received the support of the party apparatus, dominated as it was by the White House. Senators McCarthy and Kennedy, meanwhile, dueled in several state primaries, with Kennedy's bandwagon gathering ever-increasing speed. But on June 5, 1968, the night of an exciting victory in the California primary, Kennedy was shot to death by a young Arab immigrant resentful of the candidate's pro-Israel views. Surrounded by bitterness and frustration, the Democrats met in Chicago in late August 1968. Angry anti-war zealots, deprived by an assassin's bullet of their leading candidate, streamed menacingly into Chicago. Mayor Daley responded by arranging for barbed wire barricades around the convention hall. They called it Fort Daley, as well as thousands of police and National Guard reinforcements. Many demonstrators baited the officers in blue by calling them pigs. Other militants chanting "Ho, ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh" shouted obscenities and hurled bags and cans of excrement at police lines. As the people world over watched on television, the exasperated peace officers broke into a police riot, clubbing and manhandling innocent and guilty alike. Acrid tear gas fumes hung heavy over the city and even drifted up to candidate Humphrey's hotel suite. Hundreds of people were arrested and scores hospitalized, but there were no casualties, except, as cynics said, the Democratic Party and its candidate. Humphrey steamrolled to the nomination on the first ballot. The dovish McCarthyites failed even to secure an anti-war platform plank. Instead, the Humphrey forces, echoing the president, hammered into place their own declaration that armed force would be relentlessly applied until the enemy showed more willingness to negotiate. Scenting victory as the Democrats divided, the Republicans had jubilantly convened in plush Miami Beach, Florida, early in August 1968. Richard M. Nixon, the former vice president whom John F. Kennedy had narrowly defeated 8 years earlier, arose from his political grave to win the nomination. As a hawk on Vietnam and a right-leaning middle-of-the-roader on domestic policy, Nixon pleased the Goldwater conservatives and was acceptable to party moderates. He appealed to white Southern voters and to the, quote, law and order element when he tapped as his vice president running mate Maryland's Governor Spiro Agnew, noted for his tough stance against dissidents and black militants. The Republican platform called for victory in Vietnam and a strong anti-crime policy. A spoiler third-party ticket, the American Independent Party, added color and confusion to the campaign. It was headed by the scrappy ex-pugilist George C. Wallace, former governor of Alabama. In 1963, he had stood in the doorway to prevent 2 black students from entering the University of Alabama. Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever, he shouted. Wallace jabbed repeatedly at pointy-headed bureaucrats, and he taunted hecklers as bums in need of a bath. Speaking behind a bulletproof screen, he called for prodding the blacks into their place, with bayonets if necessary. He and his running mate, former Air Force Colonel Curtis LeMay, also proposed smashing North Vietnamese to smithereens by bombing them back to the Stone Age. Victory for Nixon. Vietnam proved a less crucial issue than expected. Between the positions of the Republicans and the Democrats, there was little choice. Both candidates were committed to carrying on the war until the enemy settled for an honorable peace, which seemed to mean an American victory. The millions of doves had no place to roost, and many refused to vote at all. Humphrey, scorched by the LBJ brand, went down to defeat as a loyal prisoner of his chief's policies, despite Johnson's last-minute effort to bail him out by announcing a total bombing halt. Nixon, who had lost a cliffhanger to Kennedy in 1960, won in 1968. He garnered 301 electoral votes, with 43.4% of the popular tally, as compared with 191 electoral votes and 42.7% of the popular votes for Humphrey. Nixon was the first president-elect since 1848 not to bring in his own coattails at least one house of Congress for his party in an initial presidential election. He carried not a single major city, thus attesting to the continued urban strength of the Democrats, who also won about 95% of the black vote. Nixon had received no clear mandate to do anything. He was a minority president who owed his election to divisions over the war and protest against the unfair draft, crime, and rioting. Wallace did worse than expected, yet he won an impressive 9,906,473 popular votes and 46 electoral votes, all from the 5 states of the Deep South, 4 of which the Republican Goldwater had carried in 1964. Wallace had remained a formidable force, for he had amassed the largest third-party popular vote in American history. Wallace had also resoundingly demonstrated the continuing power of populist politics, which appealed to voters' fears and resentments, rather than to the better angels of their nature. His candidacy foreshadowed a coarsening of American political life that would take deep root in the ensuing decades, as we all know now. The obituary of Lyndon Johnson. Talented but tragedy-struck Lyndon Johnson returned to his Texas ranch in January 1969 and died there 4 years later. His party was defeated, and the Me Too Hubert Humphrey was repudiated. Yet Johnson's legislative leadership for a time had been remarkable. No president since Lincoln had worked harder or done more for civil rights. None had showed more compassion for the poor, blacks, and the ill-educated. LBJ seemed to suffer from an inferiority complex about his own arid cultural background, and he strove furiously to prove that he could be a great people's president in the image of his idol Franklin Roosevelt. His legislative achievements in the first 3 years in his office indeed invited comparison with those of the New Deal. But by 1966, Johnson was already sinking into the Vietnam quicksands. The Republicans had made gains in Congress, and a white backlash had begun to form against the black movement. Great Society programs began to wither on the vine as soaring war costs sucked tax dollars into the military machine. Johnson had promised both guns and butter, but could not keep that promise. Ever-creeping inflation blighted the prospects of prosperity, and the war on poverty met resistance that was as stubborn as the Viet Cong, and eventually went down to defeat. Great want persisted alongside great wealth. Johnson had crucified himself on the cross of Vietnam. The Southeast Asian quagmire engulfed his noblest intentions. Committed to some degree by his two predecessors, he had chosen to defend the American foothold and enlarge the conflict rather than to be run out. He was evidently persuaded by his brightest advisors, both civilian and military, that a cheap victory was possible. It would be achieved by massive aerial bombing and large though limited troop commitments. His decision not to escalate the fighting further offended the Hawks, and his refusal to back off altogether antagonized the Doves. Like the Calvinists of colonial days, luckless Lyndon Johnson was damned if he did, and he's damned if he didn't. The cultural upheaval of the 1960s. The struggles of the 1960s against racism, poverty, and the war in Vietnam had momentous cultural consequences. The decades came to be seen as a watershed dividing two distinct eras in terms of values, morals, and behavior. Everywhere in 1960s America, a newly negative attitude towards all kinds of authority took hold. Disillusioned by the discovery that American society was not free of racism, sexism, imperialism, and oppression, many young people lost their traditional moral rudders. Neither families nor churches nor schools seemed to be able to define values and shape behavior with certainty of a shared purpose that many people believed had once existed. The upheaval even churned the tradition-bound Roman Catholic Church, among the world's oldest and most conservative institutions. Clerics abandoned their Roman collars and Latin lingo. Folk songs replaced Gregorian chants, and meatless Fridays became ancient history. No matter what the topic, conventional wisdom and inherited ideas came under fire. Trust no one over 30 was the popular sneer of the rebellious youth. Skepticism about authority had deep historical roots in American culture, and it had even bloomed in the supposedly complacent and conformist 1950s. Beat poets like Allen Ginsberg had iconoclast novelists like Jack Kerouac had voiced dark disillusion with the materialist pursuits and establishment arrogance of the Eisenhower era. In the movies like Rebel Without a Cause, that attractive young actor James Dean expressed the restless frustration of many young people. The disaffection of the young reached crisis proportions in the tumultuous 1960s. One of the first organized protests against the established authority broke out at the University of California at Berkeley in 1964. In the so-called free speech movement, leader Mario Savio, condemning the impersonal university machine more tied to corporate interest than humane values, urged his fellow students to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, and you've got to make it stop. But in only a few years, the clean-cut Berkeley activists and their sober-minded sit-ins would seem downright quaint. Fired by outrage against the war in Vietnam, some sons and daughters of the middle class became radical political rebels, while others turned to mind-bending drugs, tuned into acid rock, and dropped out of straight society. Others did their own thing in communes or alternative institutions. Patriotism became a dirty word. Beflowered women in trousers and long-haired men with earrings heralded the rise of the self-conscious counterculture blatantly opposed to traditional American ways. The 1960s also witnessed a sexual revolution, though its novelty and scale are often exaggerated. Without a doubt, the introduction of the birth control pill in 1960 made unwanted pregnancies much easier to avoid and sexual appetites easier to satisfy. But as early as 1948, Indiana University sexologist Dr. Alfred Kinsley had published sensational revelations about American sexual habits and sexual behavior in the human male, followed 5 years later by sexual behavior in the human female. Based on thousands of interviews, Kinsey's findings about the incidence of premarital sex and adultery caused a ruckus at the time and have been hotly debated ever since. Most controversial was Kinsey's estimate that 10% of American males were homosexuals. Whatever the exact number, by the 1960s, gay men and lesbians were increasingly emerging from the closet and demanding sexual tolerance. The Mattachine Society, founded in Los Angeles in 1951, was a pioneering advocate for gay rights. A brutal attack on gay men by off-duty police officers at New York's Stonewall Inn in 1969 powerfully energized gay and lesbian militancy. Widening worries in the late 80s about sexually transmitted diseases like genital herpes and AIDS, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, finally slowed but did not reverse the sexual revolution. Launched in youthful idealism, many of the cultural revolutions of the 1960s sputtered out in violence and cynicism. Students for a Democratic Society, once at the forefront of the anti-poverty and anti-war campaigns, had by decade's end spawned an underground terrorist group called the Weathermen. Peaceful civil rights demonstrations had given way to blockbusting urban riots, which started as apparently innocent experiments with drugs like marijuana and LSD, had fried many youthful brains and spawned a loathsome underworld of drug lords and addicted users. Straight-laced guardians of respectability denounced the self-indulgent romanticism of the flower children as the beginning of the end of modern civilization. Sympathetic observers hailed the greening of America, the replacement of materialism and imperialism by a new consciousness of human values. The upheavals of the 1960s could be largely attributed to three Ps: the youthful population bulge, protests against racism and the Vietnam War, and the apparent permanence of prosperity. As the decade flowed into the 1970s, the flower children grew older and had children of their own. The civil rights movement fell silent, the war ended, and economic stagnation blighted the bloom of prosperity. Young people in the 1970s seemed more concerned with finding a job in the system than with tearing the system down. But if the counterculture had not managed fully to replace older values, it had weakened their grip, perhaps permanently.